Thank you very much, Paula. It is indeed my great pleasure to be here this evening also, and to have the opportunity to enjoy Dr Garret FitzGerald's company. I have grown up in Ireland and remember very clearly when Garret the Good was Taoiseach, and it left a very serious mark on my life, because although I've clearly opted to join a different party, I do believe that the values that Dr FitzGerald upheld in all his life as a politician are the values that I would like to believe I too would uphold if I'm elected. But I believe too they're the values that politicians should always seek to uphold. And we are fortunate that he is here with us, but unfortunate perhaps that many in the political system appear to have moved away from the values that he cherished and I think displayed very clearly in all his time in Dáil Éireann. So we'll start, and I hope that we can exchange some thoughts and some views, and that then there'll be an opportunity for you to join in, because I'm sure that many of you here have probably relished the opportunity to ask Dr FitzGerald a question. So I'm going to read first of all a quote. "Garret the Good is to the blue shirts what the Taj Mahal is to India, or the microchip to new technology. No Fine Gael leader who has followed him has managed to carry the depth of affection and esteem commanded by the man who wore odd shoes and could recite airline timetables by heart. His father was even in the GPO in 1916, and perhaps your mother too.
Yes.
You couldn't get a finer pedigree." And that's a quote from the journalist Justine McCarthy earlier on this year. So I'd like to ask you, first of all, where did the term Garret the Good come from?
It was invented to damage me, because there's something about the kind of country we were at that time.
Yeah, we'll just turn the microphone.
Oh, sorry. It was thought that it was a negative effect, and it seemed to me very odd to live in a country where that was thought to be something you could say about somebody to damage them as much as possible. We've changed a bit since then, I think.
We have, and ironically, the expression has come all the way around and now is something that people would describe in the meaning of it, the original meaning of the word good, and I think people would refer, as Justine has here, to you as Garret the Good. I'm interested to know what motivated you originally to go into politics, given that you were the man who, you know, people joke about your capacity to recite airline timetables, but you know, that was obviously something about your capacity to absorb the very fine detail of things. But why politics?
Well, of course, my parents were political. My father was Minister of Foreign Affairs, the first Minister of External Affairs after the state was recognised internationally, and then Minister of Defence. I was very happy that Fianna Fáil won the election in 1932, because I saw much more of my father after that when he ceased to be a minister. But I wasn't very political then. But then, brought up in that atmosphere, my mother was a Republican in the Civil War, opposed to my father during those early years. And politics was part of our life. Now, my elder brothers, there were three of them, they were all of a generation who saw that their parents in politics would be around for a long time, and none of them thought politics was possible. But when it came to my time, I could see that, you know, there would be room for me at some stage. And in school I had a master, a priest in charge of the debating society, who encouraged me to think about politics. My father, however, did not like the idea of young people standing for election to strengthen their parental relationship, and hoped that I would not get involved until he was gone and forgotten, and I'd made my own way and acquired my own experience. So pietas required that I don't enter politics till I was in my late 30s.
How refreshing. Something that probably doesn't happen often enough now.
Yeah, I worry a bit about people going to politics too young. I think the longest you can remain in politics and be reasonably sane is about 25 years. So if you go in your mid-20s, well, what do you do after the age of 50 when you're worn out by politics? So
Is it?
I think it is important that people acquire relevant experience. Oh dear.
Yes.
Before politics of some kind.
Right, so you're not in agreement with the idea of a career politician per se who perhaps leaves the university, knocks around for a couple of years and then seeks election either at local level or directly into the
Well,
door.
you can't bring very much experience in that case, and then you'll be worn out too soon.
Right, well that would seem to rule out quite a lot of people sitting in Dáil Éireann then. Tell me.
I don't mean you can't make rules for people, but
No.
was
No, but that's
how
your
I
observation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, is it true that Charles Haughey, among others, encouraged you to join Fianna Fáil?
He asked me to, yes.
And tell us about that.
I thought it was a verbal invitation, but I found a letter from him some time ago, 1961. He had asked me to do a report on why Fianna Fáil didn't do better in the October 61 election. And I said yes for £100. I was not in politics, and I was a consultant. And so we thought you'd do it for us, just to the public good. And I said, no, thank you. I was a consultant. And then he asked me to join the party, which I politely rejected. I did attend one meeting. I was asked to attend Dún Laoghaire, a meeting about the Irish language, sandwiched between two enthusiasts for the revival of the language, and I gave my views on the subject. They broke up into working groups, and when they came back, a number of the working groups agreed with me, disagreed with the Gael. And two working groups, the chairman refused to report because the dreadful things they were saying, they agreed with me. So at the end of the meeting, I had to leave a bit early, and there were a number of ministers in front of me, and I said that I was very happy to have attended the meeting and made such progress to have converted Fianna Fáil, 1/3 of Fianna Fáil, into a party concerned genuinely about Irish unity and concerned about the divisive element of trying to impose a language in the whole country, which was not that of many people in the country, and I was happy to have a chance to do that. I wasn't asked back.
And clearly you had no regret about the fact that you turned down that request.
I recognised that Mr. Haughey was going to be a very powerful figure, probably Taoiseach eventually, and there wasn't the kind of party I wanted to belong to. I then had to decide between the other parties, and while I had, like you, concern for Labour, there were several things about Labour. The deep conservatism of some of its members, the extreme right-wing members at the time, was pretty off-putting, and their links to the unions seemed to me to inhibit their capacity to serve the public good generally. It's not a hostility to unions, but any interest group too close to the connection with the party is damaging. And I finally decided to join Fine Gael, which was easier for me because that's the party my father had been in, and I had more influence there. But basically what decided the matter was, when you go into politics, I don't think you should join the party you agree with necessarily. That's too simple. You join the party you can change. It's a dynamic view of politics rather than a passive view. And I said, join Fine Gael.
So what was it you saw that you could change?
Oh, a lot of things there. They had accepted the Fianna Fáil anti-partition nonsense with the North, doing terrible damage, encouraging violence, ultimately in the part of some extreme nationalists, and creating intense fear in part of unions, which made them more hostile to the minority there. All that thing I found. In fact, when I joined the party, I made a condition I would not be required to do any of that nonsense, which I had been denouncing as a journalist since 1948. But other things too. But basically, the party had good people. It did have a sense of the public good, which would occasionally transcend party considerations, and I was happy to be in it and eventually to lead it.
Now, I think you told me the last time that we met, which was last year, that you had, at a very early age, I think in your teens, decided firmly in your own head that you would be Taoiseach one day.
Well, not quite. The priest who suggested enter politics, my recollection is he suggested this as an ultimate situation, but and remains as a possibility. But of course, becoming leader of a party is an absolute matter of luck. As the opportunity arises. I mean, you can't say, I'm going to be Taoiseach.
No, but to have, I suppose, an ambition that you would lead, perhaps, or that you would be a great influencer. Do you believe, did you have that sort of ambition?
Oh, yes,
I don't think it is a matter of luck, actually, that one rises to be the leader of a party.
No.
I think you have to have
No,
a
it's not a
vision.
chance. And for example, in my case, I wouldn't even have stood for the leadership had Tom Higgins and Declan Costello not become judges. And in their absence, then, fair enough, but I would not have challenged either of them. So, it is a matter of luck as well.
Now, you took on a very demoralised party in 1977 after Liam Cosgrave's defeat. So perhaps you might have some advice to offer Brian Cowan's replacement after the next election, when indeed Fianna Fáil looks like it will be, perhaps in the same place. But I'm sort of talking, I suppose, about your capacity to restore and to rebuild, and what sort of things it takes to do that.
Well, they say you should invest in a company when it's down at the bottom and a chance of growth. So maybe people will find a Fianna Fáil a party worth joining now in order to develop it. It's a party that has a great record. I don't have strong partisan views about parties, and I always think that our parties in this country have done a good job, because we inherited a very fractious situation after the Civil War. And basically, it was necessary, on the one hand, for Fianna Fáil to engage in a lot of rhetorical nationalism in order to pull people in from extreme republicanism and stabilise things. On the other hand, Fine Gael and Labour indeed also, after 1969, weren't required to do that, and they could be more adventurous, more open, look to a pluralist society eventually in the 70s, and the interaction of Fianna Fáil on the one hand, its job, and Fine Gael and Labour doing theirs. I think we're very fortunate, actually, in the long run, how we came out of all that.
But when you were actually there as leader, the day you became leader, and looked at your party and could see there was a bit of a wreck there, what did you have to do in order to rebuild it? Like, what was your priority?
Well, I was really a policy person. I wasn't much into an organisation. When I became leader, I had to be into an organisation. And when I thought about it, I realised we had a major problem, because we had one TD in each constituency, or almost all of them, and two, I think, in Dunleary possibly at the time. And that TD controlled the organisation, and his primary concern had to be to make sure no good candidate stood to oppose him and perhaps challenge him. And as the national executive of the party was formed from the constituencies upwards, the entire purpose of the national executive seemed to me to make sure that no extra seats were won. So it seemed very simple to me. You change that. So I went around the country, talking to people in every constituency, having a public meeting in each place, by the way. I didn't see much point spending the entire time with members of the party who were in favour of me anyway. And those public meetings were, for me, very educational. As a Dubliner, I needed to find out much more about how people in the rest of the country thought. And we had, we had 25,000 people, 1,000 questions I answered in these meetings. I learned a lot from it. But also enabled me to come forward with proposals for a new constitution, under which the party conference would select some of the national executive and other units, not just the TDs. So the TDs were put in a minority and were unable to continue blocking the selection of good candidates. And we had a difficult moment in 1980 when the TDs weren't very happy with me because they saw what I was at. And I pointed out to them that because we had mistakenly cancelled the census in 76, and equally mistakenly Jack Lynch had reintroduced the census in 79, we had an 8-year period, 71-79, with rapid economic growth, and so we had added 18 seats to the Dáil. So I said to my party, you'd need to be both stupid and lazy to lose your seat when there are 18 more seats. And we won 23 and lost one. 24 and lost one, sorry.
So that was a very good result.
I was awfully lucky, thanks to Jack Lynch. If he hadn't had the census and the first independent review of constituencies, there wasn't a gerrymander. Jack Lynch arranged at the time, and that gave me my chance.
We notice now that there's a lot of talk about coalition and how in the next government may well be a coalition, although maybe, let's say it's going to be, for the sake of this discussion, a coalition between Fine Gael and Labour, and you would have enormous experience of that. And there's this thread of thought that their policies are too different. There's too much of a gap between them. They couldn't possibly govern successfully in the situation that we're in. Now, obviously, some of that is Fianna Fáil's spin, some of it is observation. What is your observation about the strength of coalition rather than the weakness?
Well, I mean, in order to get
if indeed you agree there is a strength, I'm sure.
Oh, Lord, yes. One thing about coalition is that because it isn't just one party, there are constructive tensions which are beneficial, I think, to the community as a whole. One party on its own, I'm not sure you can trust them, but if you have two parties interacting with each other, you can get, I think, a better result. But you have, first of all, to agree on your policies. And there are some points of disagreement. There's some things the parties have in common, which there's no difficulty about. Obviously, on the question of tax versus spending cuts, there are stated differences which will be hugely exaggerated during the campaign. When the campaign is over, they'll be sorted out. How? Well, I think a little bit of give on both sides will be desirable and will happen.
So it's actually, you believe it's almost that simple that, as you say, in the heat of a campaign, everything will be magnified and almost distorted. But when people come to sit at the table, they will say, well, actually, we have to agree here. This is what we're going to do.
Endless stupid things will be said during the election campaign. Pay no attention to them.
No, well, I won't be uttering any of them, obviously, myself.
Not you particularly.
No, definitely not.
No, Susan, no.
But no, so that in effect, that idea that campaigns are exactly a sort of a showcase or a moment of almost distortion, but that in the cold reality, sitting down and tugging things out and pushing them together, you think actually, do you think perhaps that might be of benefit to the country in the state we're in, that two parties who are not completely at all the same might come up with a version that's almost better? Or is that too much to ask for?
No, I think the interaction of the two, both in the negotiation of the programme and in the administration thereafter, I think that could be very constructive. I mean, in the existing government, the Green Party, who are now not really well thought of for some people, they have brought a different dimension in. They have some things that they've achieved. Not all of it I agree with. Some are a bit naive, I think, but basically it's been a better government because they're there. It seems to be just the same. A less bad government, shall we say.
Oh dear.
So let's overdo it.
But there would have been people who would have said that the Greens might have pulled out of government earlier.
I should have, yeah. I know. They didn't handle it well.
All right. So perhaps that was a level of naivety, perhaps.
Well, it's difficult when you're in a government like that. To choose the moment to leave is tricky. They're particularly inept at the particular moment they chose, I think, but it's not easy to choose when is the best time to go in those circumstances.
Well, not of course. If it is an asylum, as Mr. Gordon
we had
told
difficulty at the end because Labour at that time did have problems with some of the cuts which had to be made after a difficult 4 years. And we found eventually that we couldn't reach agreement in December. So we decided there's no point having a break-up now. Let's have it in January. We fixed a date when we'd meet and disagree in January. And it was a very friendly disagreement, and they went out to the front steps and said, while they're leaving, I gave a press conference and said what we're trying to do, and produced a budget to present to the people instead of the Royal. The people rejected the budget, and Fianna Fáil then implemented it. It's not a bad arrangement. So that's the way it happened. But then it was Gemma Hussey, in fact, who said afterwards, could we have a dinner for the real government? So we had a wonderful night together till 4 a.m. of our two parties, whose personal relationships were excellent. Just each of us had difficulties with what the other position was, and it was a friendly division.
And nobody was on Morning Hour the following morning, obviously. Now, people have been saying a lot about, the difficulties that there are, and they've been saying that perhaps we don't need the parties that we have, that we need something new, that we need something different, that we need, well, I don't know what it is that people believe we need, but that certainly the political system is so broken that it can't be restored, and that essentially in 2011, that's what we should be expecting. I wonder what your observation is about that.
Well, new parties are difficult things to create, and none of them ever lasted. We have the same, basically, three parties. Originally, Sinn Féin had been now. Same three parties as we had 90 years ago. Basically, the others have all left. Sinn Féin are there at the moment. Perhaps in due course they may leave also, the scene as all the others have.
Why is that? Why is it that only three parties have endured in a state which has grown up largely in the last 50 years, and there could well have been. I mean, we've seen them, you're right, we've seen them come and go and they've gone, but why do you think those three have endured? Is it simply the capacity to longevity or brand or
Parties
something?
are biological entities of a sort, I suppose, and they have great experience and a background and tradition, and they're still there. But anyway, I think to create another party would be very difficult from scratch at this stage. It has been done before, but I don't think it's the answer. But what we need is a government which will face up to the very real necessity for a radical change in our political system. I'm not sure we yet have that. There's a very good Fine Gael document, I have to say, which is widely accepted by people outside the party. There's very good ideas in it. But they don't include any radical change in the electoral system. 20 less TDs. Well, in the present system, given the great difficulty we've had to get enough people to form an intelligent cabinet, what we've got, what do you want to reduce the pool you're going to draw from? Now, you don't need to have as big a number, but we need to look at an alternative system. I was talking about this morning at Joe Mulholland's thing about his book was launching after the meeting in Donegal in summer. I was putting forward, and many others there were putting forward, the idea of a need to change the electoral system. The present system is very negative. I mean, you have multi-seat constituencies in which TDs are busy attacking each other within each party. Now, it's a good thing to have conflict between parties. It's not particularly helpful to people trying to do each other down inside the same party. And of course, the competition to hold one's seat is such a factor, and understandably so. It's a career, and people want to remain in the career. The consequences of that have been a huge emphasis on working the constituency and the selection of candidates who will secure local support for local reasons, and many of whom have no interest in the country as a whole. Donegal by-election, all the speeches made there and statements issued were all about Donegal. Okay, in a by-election that's inevitable, but a general election to have it all done like that is really, you don't get a wide range of people, and people will not stand for election if you have to go. The only way to get in and eventually have a chance of playing a constructive part in the country is to stand at local level for local council. And many of the people who could really contribute something very substantial to our state's future are not going to do that. And if they tried, they wouldn't be chosen anyway, that system, because of the type of infighting that is at present. So we need to change the system. Now, what do we need in the system? You need to have single-seat constituencies to avoid all that, and the waste of energy of 5 TDs being approached by local persons, each write letters off about something they're not entitled to. I mean, this is rubbish. The single seat would resolve that. But there is a problem with the single seat system. If you have it on its own, you could end up with a parliament, a Dáil, very unrepresentative of how people voted. Look at the English system, first past the post. The results of the elections there are absurd. They bear no relationship to what people have voted for at all. So you're going to have to modify the single seat system by choosing some other, the minority at least, of people by some other method who can be then added to top up party representation to ensure that Parliament is representative, proportionally representative broadly, of the entire political spectrum. So the key is, I don't see any other way to get a better political system, get rid of the unfortunate things about the features of the present system, and give us the chance to get more good people into politics, because that system would enable each party to nominate on the supplementary list some people who they believe could be very useful as ministers, put them in there, have them elected on the list, and then they'd be available for cabinet. Because we have had the extraordinary experience of a government, and I have to say an opposition as well, which totally failed to understand or face up to the decision to join the euro. Join the euro, we can no longer devalue. Consequently, if you spend too much money and inflate and prices rise and wages rise, as it happened in the early years of this decade, you end up completely uncompetitive, your economy ruined, exports collapsing, jobs lost. All this happened before we ever reached the housing bubble. Nobody paid any attention to it. Now people realize it was a disaster. So we need a better system. And something along those lines is required.
Do you think, I mean, we may need it, but are we going to get it?
I don't know. That would require, it's obvious that people I talked to this morning, the strength of feeling about the need to change is there. How is that to be communicated? I think there's only one way. Everybody who thinks there should be a change should talk to any politicians they know, of any party, it doesn't matter what party, and urge them to face up to this. And there are people in each party, including the present government party, who recognise the need for change. There are good people there. And, but it's only if the force of inertia in politics is so very powerful, it's only if that's challenged by ordinary people going to anybody they know in the party, particularly if somebody of influence in the party, and urging that they face up to this, and when they come into government, make change. I know in Fianna Fáil there are people who feel that, and not for any reason, motivation, or just advantage to the party. There are people who genuinely feel, as I do, that change is needed. And if we can just persuade enough people in the new government of that, I think that with the pressure of public opinion, there could be change. But if we just all sit around and do nothing, nothing will happen, of course.
Well, when Enda Kenny made that rather surprise announcement earlier on in the year about abolishing the Seanad, and that's in fact where you started your political career, is it not?
Yes.
Is that the kind of firm and decisive reform we need?
No,
no.
It wasn't thought out at all. I mean, you can argue for the Senate, but basically my experience of the Senate, even with its mad system of election and the way in which it's composed, despite that, it is a very useful revising chamber. And there are many laws which the Dáil doesn't interest itself much in. It goes to the Senate, and you then get intelligent debate. I found it all along when I brought in, the only law I ever brought in my life, because I was Foreign Affairs and then Taoiseach, was one to establish a National Archive. I didn't introduce that to the Dáil. They wouldn't be interested at all. I brought it to the Senate. Excellent debate from people there. Lots of amendments proposed and accepted by me, and a National Archive established, which is now virtually in ruins because of the total neglect by the present government. It won't even establish the council to run it, which the law requires to be there. But basically, it was a good law, just not implemented any longer. And a good law because we had good debate. We had this extraordinary spectacle yesterday of a debate on the Dáil for 5 hours on a hugely complex bill of 76 clauses. Not debated or discussed at all. Now, we have far too much of that. The Dáil has been degraded by constantly, at the end of the season, every time in July and December, being required by the executive to rush through legislation without looking at it at all. We get bad laws that way. Now, we need more debate. If to the Senate, you have less debate. I don't feel terribly strongly about it, but I don't understand what the rationale of it is. Save a bit of money? Well, somebody said to me today, why not have senators and just don't pay them? If they want to serve the public, to come along and senators and do it. Why do you have to pay them? It wouldn't go down very well with some people, but that's probably an extreme view. Nonetheless, I think to abolish the Senate to save a few quid is not really very sensible. Either it's useful or it isn't. Either it could be made much more useful or it won't be. And it could be. There's a proposal to reform the Senate, make it a much better body doing very useful work. So to abolish at this stage seems to me to be a mistake, but there you are.
Do you believe that we have effectively lost the values of public service? The original values that I would see. My memory or my imprint is someone like you would have espoused those values very clearly.
Yes,
you didn't go into it for what you could get out of it. You went into it for what you could put into it.
I spent 11 years trying to establish a small company which paid dividends and led me to afford to be a minister, which was so badly paid at that time. And when I became a minister, I had to move from a nice big house in Nightingale Road out to a very small house with small, narrow rooms in Roebuck before I managed to get into town again with the help of my younger son and my daughter, because my income dropped 40% overnight that time.
So what is your? So that's a difficult one. People say if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And some people would say we're paying not peanuts and we've still got monkeys.
So, we were grossly underpaid and have recently been grossly overpaid. There was a point somewhere in the middle it should have just stopped, and it didn't. So that has to be dealt with. It has been dealt with. Ministers' salaries have been substantially reduced, and my worry has been that the pensions of ministers have not been reduced. And been told you can't legally do it, constitutionally. I think it's rubbish. Why don't they do it and see what ex-minister will sue for the extra money? I'd like to see the day. Oh. So now it's left to individuals to volunteer. I volunteered some time ago. I have to re-volunteer now as a further cut in ministers' salaries. So I'll go back and look at that next week or after Christmas.
So when people talk about this second republic or renewing the constitution
I got sidetracked myself. What I wanted to say really was that we inherited a state which had one extraordinary characteristic. There were two lots of revolutionaries who fell out over the oath of fidelity to the constitution and to the king as head of the Commonwealth, not of allegiance at all. That's the wording of it. Fell over that, which is a silly thing to fall out over, I think, in retrospect. I had a civil war. But both parties were people, led by people who were totally dedicated to the good of the state as they saw it. They had a silly row over that, but the fact is they were extraordinarily honest and dedicated people. None of them looked for anything for themselves. Took their salary. De Valera even reduced the salary from 1,500 to 1,000. When he came in, thought 1,500 was too much. For today, 70,000 or so now, I suppose. But that remained. And right up to the mid-60s, when there were still a number of ministers in the government, 43 years after the state was founded, who were part of the original group who founded it. Up to that point, they were there, and they had very high standards indeed, and were deeply unhappy over what happened. I know that when a change in leadership later occurred in Fianna Fáil, I know how senior ex-ministers were desperately worried for the country and for the party. One of them asked me to come and see him, and he was dying, telling me he was deep concerned about what happened then. So, they were people who were only interested in service to the state. But that changed, I'm afraid. It was inevitable. That idealism won't remain forever. The extraordinary thing was that it did last so long. Because in other countries, revolutionaries often feather their own nests as soon as they get in. It did not happen here with either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. A great tradition which was lost, unfortunately, from the 60s onwards, I suppose.
So when people talk about this, renewing the constitution or the second republic, or are they craving that restoration of service in the sense that you talk of it? Or are they actually craving something altogether different, something that's genuinely new, that reflects Ireland in the 21st century, part of Europe, a global economy?
Well, a number of things. I think part of Europe, yes. But a civic republicanism in which politicians are primarily motivated by public good. Now, it's not easy. Don't let's fool ourselves. In politics, you have two choices all the time. One of the reasons I entered politics, back of my mind, was that it is the most morally demanding career that I know of, because in it, you're constantly faced with a choice between the right thing, which will be unpopular, or the popular thing, which will be wrong. These issues arise constantly. And if you always do the right thing, you'll not be re-elected, so there's no point. If you never do the right thing, there's no point in being there to start with. So perfectly obviously, all politics requires compromise. The compromise has to be such that enough right things are done to make up for the silly, populist things that have to be done to stay in power. It's tricky. But you shouldn't keep on attacking politicians because they face more moral dilemmas than anybody else does in their lives. You really have an enormous number of additional choices, what's right and wrong. But you don't have your own personal life. You don't have any decisions that kind to take. So it's a complicated career. And people, I think, would like to go back to what we had before and the standards we had. Not easy, but I think a lot to be done towards that. And the mood of the country is so strong that if it penetrates through the political system, not easy, we could end up with a much better society.
One of the things that people might say about the budget last week was that indeed the right thing was not done by those who are most vulnerable. That the argument about 6 billion and the bailout and the markets and the economy just took precedence to an extraordinary extent, and then we saw, child benefit
yeah,
and disability and cares, and and it felt and it feels like the most vulnerable are paying the price. Now, given what you've said about the fact we can't always do the right thing, but sometimes you have to do the right thing. What is your view about what was done there, given that the sort of Ireland we're trying to build, yes, we have to pay our debts, but how do we look after those that are most vulnerable at a point when we also are at our most vulnerable?
Well, first of all, the 6 billion was necessary. We couldn't avoid that. The choice of how you raise the 6 billion is another question. And I think it was unfortunate. One of the problems there is the deep resistance of people, middle class people particularly, to any increase in taxation. We're the most undertaxed country in the developed world, as far as I can make out. I looked at this last year and wrote about it then, wrote it more recently. And I reckon that the amount of income tax we pay is 4 billion less than would be paid in any other country in Western Europe or the United States. Because the TASC government abolished income tax for half the population, and for ones above that, reduced it to a fraction of what other people pay. But you can't convince the electorate easily about that. And as a result, the resistance to increased taxation, and of course should take in other forms as well, is very deep. And that meant it pushed them to make cuts in spending. Now they tell us...
surely that is plain wrong, is it not? That if you know that there's that public opposition, and you're right, it's very, very strong to taxation, and you go, well, I'm not going to take on that challenge. I tell you what, it's much easier to go for those people who have no voice, who actually have not the capacity to stand up and take on the government, and therefore are always the ones that end up taking the punishment.
Well, let's be fair. They tried to avoid the previous budget, no increase in tax, and it's postponed. Originally, 60% of the cuts were to come in tax increases. That was the April 2009 budget. That was abandoned by August under pressure of public opinion. But
was it really pressure from public opinion, or was it vested interests who simply don't want to pay the tax and are much happier for that shift to go?
The vested interest of the whole of public opinion. It's not some small group of rich people trying to rig the thing. There's a bit of that about, no doubt. But the fact is it is the taxpayers generally who are convinced they're paying too much tax, cannot understand that we're grossly undertaxed. And of course there's an argument that if you increase income tax in particular, you discourage people working. There's some truth in that. And it's also argued, I think this is less valid, that economists have found that cuts in spending are less damaging to future growth than increases in tax. I think that argument is dubious and is used by people on the right for their own benefit. But they meant we came back in the budget, are forced back, and we do have substantial increases in taxation. What should have happened, of course, is that they should have gone for the water tax and the housing and the property tax. I introduced a wealth tax that I got through Fine Gael back in 1974. A wealth tax to replace death duties. Death duties were such that if nobody in the family died for 80 years, you paid nothing. If 3 people died in 1 year, you lost everything you had. It's a mad system. I introduced a small wealth tax to replace it, resisted hugely by the civil service, who did everything they could to prevent us getting it through, abolished, of course, by Fianna Fáil. And then I came back to government again. I brought in a residential property tax. What happened? Abolished by Fine Gael and Labour in the mid-90s for reasons I cannot fathom. I raised that recently at a Labour Party meeting with Rory Quinn. Asked him why he did it, and he had no very good reason except there was pressure from the other party, Fine Gael. But there you are. Now we have to go back to it again, because the best tax you can have is one that doesn't affect people's decisions in a negative economic way. If you income tax, yes, if you push it up too much, yeah, people will become discouraged and not do as much work, possibly. So it's said anyway. I don't know what kind of people they are, but there you are. There's something in that, I'm sure. But property tax doesn't have any negative effects at all. Okay, we've got problems about how you do it, given some people have bought houses recently at extravagant amounts and paid much too much tax. You have to deal with all those problems. But what did the government do? Nothing. That was recommended, 15 months ago. Was any work done to prepare for that? None. What about the water charge? No, nothing done on that. So they ended up, the only thing they could do was increase income tax. Well, some other taxes as well, but mainly income tax, which is not the best tax to increase. But basically, it was not well handled. And then, okay, then where do you make the cuts? Well, there are two things. You try to minimize the negative effect until it's well off, and do nothing to damage education. When I was in government, Alan's there, Alan knows the story. Alan went on holidays once, and we were preparing a 3-year plan. In his absence, I rang Gemma Hussey, and she was looking for much more money than she was going to look for. 4 times as big an increase, and I'd give her twice. And it all done for when Alan came back, got it through. The result is, in our period in government, there was a significant increase in the number of people of secondary school, and a 50% increase in people in higher education, preparing for the Celtic Tiger and giving you the people we needed for that. We got a huge benefit from it. Alan never appointed me as teacher, Minister of Finance again after that. You can do this once, Chief Minister of Finance, you can't do it twice. But it was worth doing. You must protect education. The one thing is clear from all economic studies is education is the area you must protect. And the poor, the people you must protect. And the budget we've got certainly is a ham-fisted one in that way. And I think that the blind and the carers are saving us billions by looking after their family. Why pick on them? Now, it's true, one has to say, the cost of living is down by 5% in the last 18 months. You can make a case for saying that some small reduction in social welfare leaves nobody worse off as a result because of that drop in the cost of living. So maybe some cuts had to be made, but they shouldn't have hit the carers, they shouldn't have hit the blind, and they could be much more intelligently done, and they shouldn't have hit education. This government, I have to say, in all the periods in the government, have been hitting education the whole way along. Some good things have been done at the second level. In the higher education, they've neither invigilated sufficiently what's been happening in the sector, nor have they provided the resources needed to continue to have a good higher education system. So there are problems. So yes, just mistakes were made. And I have to say, if you're in government, you're bound to make mistakes. In government, you're so cut off from the world outside. Every government makes mistakes because you really are cut off. You're all talking to each other all the time. You're not, in spite of all the consistency work, you're not getting any feedback of a constructive kind. And I can see why some of the mistakes were made. But I think it was a bit of a rather unfortunate budget, really, in its outcome. But you can't ignore the fact there's a 5% drop in the cost of living. In government, I brought in a 25% increase in social welfare because I knew we were in for 6-8 years of misery, and everybody's income would be reduced, would be all worse off in the crisis that had been left by our predecessors. Our predecessors trebled the national debt and increased public spending 2.5 times in 4 years, leaving us in an appalling condition. So I knew tough things have to be done. I didn't want the poor to suffer. In retrospect, it was a mistake. If I'd said 20%, not 25%, we wouldn't have had to introduce tax on clothes. The budget didn't actually fall on that issue, but we certainly, it didn't help. So maybe we went too far in that direction.
While we might talk about, the vulnerable and the need to protect those, but there's the other great issue that's even more difficult to know how to arrive at or to succeed with now is the notion of a much more equal society. And of course that's at the core of what TASC's
yes.
sort of work is, the idea that we must constantly strive for a more equal society. And we know that we are not, and we know that all the figures would show we are less equal now, and in fact we were less equal really during the Celtic Tiger also. So
yes.
What given the fact that you've looked over a long period of time, you've served in government, you've observed from outside, first of all, do you believe in the idea of an equal society? And secondly, how in this context, with no money and enormous debts, how do we still strive to achieve that?
Huh.
I mean, it's an enormous question, I accept, and we could sit here for 3 hours and even only get to the beginning of it, but it is something so enormous that I suspect you have at least something that you can articulate at least as a starting point.
In fact, curiously, in the period of the 50s through the 60s and 70s, government policies were in fact directed towards greater equality, both parties in government. And in fact, in that period, there was significant redistribution. All that stopped the crisis of the 80s. My 25% increase in social welfare was the last gasp of that. And when the crisis was over, we didn't come back to that. We become a selfish society. And the concern of politicians in those decades, 60s and 70s, to make it a more equal society, they didn't talk much about it, just did it in that time. The redistribution of income was very substantial then, nobody ever looks at it. And since then, they've substituted indirect taxes, which hit the poor more, for direct taxes, which bother the better off. We become a selfish society, a greedy society, and we become less equal at that time. Up to this budget, in fact, the net effect of what was done, has been done in the previous 18 months, was in fact quite progressive. This budget is the first one which seems really to be pretty negative on that. And it needn't have been as negative as that. It could have been better handled. But for the future, well, the only one can say is we can hope that we'll come out of this a more socially conscious people and less greedy, perhaps. When I say equality, well, people are all going to be equal, but you certainly make them less unequal than they are. But that will require a change in attitudes, which may happen when we come out of this, but we can't look that far ahead. That's a few years ahead. I hope it will.
Dr. FitzGerald, thank you very much indeed.